Bishop Philip Poole on the future of the church.
So when my kids were younger, they used to watch a show on TV called Sesame Street. And so this little chat is brought to you by the number 4 and the letter C. I want to talk about context, change, challenge, and consistency. Context, change, challenge, and consistency. So let's start with context. I don't know if you remember the story in the Acts of the Apostles when Paul makes a missionary trip to the town of Athens. And he starts out by saying, the speech actually begins something like, the translation is men, but people of Athens, I see that you are religious people because I've looked around in the town and I see the altar to the unknown God. And so I want to talk to you about the God that I know. Your God is unknown, mine is known. And I thought about that, and I thought, Paul was pretty smart, actually. Before he had anything to say to anybody, he figured out where he was. He took the time to go to the marketplace. Like, you can't make that speech unless you've been through the marketplace and see the altar to the unknown God. You can't have that speech. So he went around and he listened. And I think that's so very important for us these days, to be greatly aware of the context in which ministry is taking place. So let's talk about the context of Holy Trinity Thornhill as I understand it 185 years ago. Canada was not yet a country. Ontario doesn't yet exist. Toronto officially became Toronto in 1834, a name which has actually, I discovered, been used for a variety of locations along the north shore of what we currently call Lake Ontario. It was called York. Big surprise, guess who was here? The British. And guess where we come from? There you go. So the pioneers were beginning to populate this area. The area around what we now know as Toronto was beginning to thrive. Like most places, there were 3 things that drove growth in Canada: the roads, the rails, and rivers. Right? And so the pioneers were populating the area. Yonge Street was an old Aboriginal route connecting Lake Ontario to Lake Simcoe, and it attracted John Graves Simcoe's attention. He was the lieutenant governor, I guess, or the governor general, whatever the area, and he gave orders to carve out a street, and he named it after his old buddy, the Minister of War, a fellow named Sir George Young. The Queen's York Rangers, who I had the privilege of being their honorary chaplain for a number of years, they still have a little, not a garrison, but little armories in Aurora. They were engaged to build the road. And land settlers were offered 200 acres of land grant, provided that they did a couple of things, one of which was clearing 33 feet of land across the property for a road. And so the settlers were mostly United Empire loyalists. There'd been a big dust-up in 1776 to the south of us, and the folks from the United Empire loyalists headed to the north. Canada was opened up, as I said, with the roads, the rivers, and the rails, all of which were part of the history of what once was called the police village of Thornhill. It was always interesting when I was here in 1977, 1980, we actually weren't real sure where Thornhill was, because it wasn't really a place. Like, there was Vaughan and there was Markham, but we were kind of, who were we? So Benjamin Thorne, William Parsons were local business people, and they saw the need for an Anglican, or more particularly a Church of England church. And so in 1829, they started to build at Yonge and Royal Orchard. Karen and I had an apartment over in Inverloch and used to go down over there at the old site years ago. They were looking for a place of worship, and they looked for a churchyard. They wanted a place to worship God and a place to bury their dead. So Methodists did the same thing. And they were great demographics for the Anglican Church, for people of faith, God-fearing people. Now, you fast forward to 1950. And what happens? The war is over. Canada's starting to come into its own as a country. There's a time of increasing prosperity. This is Canada's time. And according to the history on your own website, the hustle and bustle of Yonge Street bugged the people who were going to church, and they said, nope, we got to move. And so they moved it quite incredibly, board by board, to this site to get off of Yonge Street and away from the hustle and bustle. And my image of that is the old streetcar, I guess, that would go up, makes its way up north, and I imagine the noise and clamor of all of that would have been more than you can ask or imagine, and so they wanted to come get off Main Street. Oftentimes what Anglicans do, if you look at Anglican churches, very often they're not on main streets, they're somewhere else. And so they moved, and you moved to here to Brook Street. So 1977, you look around at the community, there's still a fair number of folks with a British background. They're not very diverse church. I remember Bob would always talk about, well, there are people from 11 different countries here, but actually there was only one from each. It was not a very diverse, it was a large church. It was the 5th largest in the Diocese of Toronto, but it was not a diverse church. And the church still had a reasonable significance in the lives of people. That was the era. Secular humanism was beginning to creep in. This community was growing. Costain, among others, were building suburbs to Thornhill. In fact, where my wife and her family settled in on I think it was Wild Cherry Lane, over in what was then a fairly new suburb. So today, fairly high Jewish population. I think it's a fairly high European and Italian, I'm told, and frankly, they're not the best demographics for the Anglican Church. The church has to respond to its context. We can no longer just open the doors on Sunday morning and hope folks will come in. Ministry today, to be effective, really needs to know its context, to really look at it, to understand it, to engage with it. Context is critical. So it's important, in my view, that local parishes be real aware of where they're located. The area that I oversee, York Credit Valley, is likely the most diverse area in all of Canada for the Anglican Church. That's the first time I've ever said that, but I think I believe that. We are a highly, highly diverse area. You could serve in York Credit Valley, move every 5 years as a parish priest, and never hit the same church twice. I mean, about all the Anglo-Catholic churches, I've won large churches. I think among the smallest is a parish of about 15 on Sunday morning. We have parishes that are conservative, evangelical, very liberal parishes with rogue choirs, the 2 best rogue choirs by jury competition in Canada, parishes that don't have choirs, parishes that have electronic. Every church is different. And I think there are 11 different language groups on Sunday morning. That services are conducted 11 different languages on Sunday morning. Very different context than I grew up in this. I was born in Toronto. Toronto the good. You know, WASP was the expression in those days. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That was Toronto. Now the mother tongue of Toronto is something other than, for the majority of citizens, is something other than English. We have to adapt to them. That's good news for us, because Anglicans are in 165 countries in the world. We're not just British Isles by a long shot. We're in 165 countries in the world, and we need to continue to work on how we welcome folks from other Anglicans into our context. And frankly, I don't think we're very good at that, but we're working at it. But the context means going out and figuring out where the community's at. It's no longer a matter of the church saying, okay, this is the program we need to be doing, come and join us. It's now a matter of much more dialogue with the community, in my view, see what we can come alongside for the common good. Take the opportunity for new missional opportunities, what we call fresh expressions. That's the current language of the day. But there are opportunities available for us, but they're not going to take place here, they're going to take place outside. So context is very important. First C. Eyes glazing over yet? We're okay? Okay. Second is change. Now there is a rumor that the church is against change, that it never changes. And actually, that is not correct. In my lifetime, I've been a lifelong Anglican. I was born, as Steve said, into an Anglican rectory. And we lived in Peterborough, and before we came back to Toronto. And so I've been, my entire life, for good or ill, has been in the Diocese of Toronto. So this is what's happened in the Diocese of Toronto, in the Anglican Church of Canada, in my lifetime. There have been 3 prayer books. There was the Book of Common Prayer pre-1962, then the 62 on Monday, counting the 59, and then the Book of Alternative Services. There have been 3 hymn books. There was a blue one that I grew up with, then we had the red one that came out of the conversation with United and Anglican Church that failed union talks in the 70s, and now a new blue one. We could have gone for another color, really. The third, remarriage of divorced persons, an enormous change. I can't tell you the number of people that have come up to me and said, you know, the church treated me abysmally in the 1960s. They would only do my wedding if I did it in the rector's house or in the chapel of the church and all that sort of stuff. And thank you for now allowing the remarriage and divorced persons. The role of women as the role of women, period, but the role of women as church wardens was not part of that in my experience as a kid. The ordination of women, lay participation in services. We always refer to Mr. Poole reading the burial office. I mean, it was never, no one ever, there was very little, the odd lay reader, but not very much involvement. Ordination of women as bishops, the ordination of gay and lesbian persons, creation of almost solely Eucharistic communities. When I was a kid, Holy Communion was once a month in most churches, and sometimes first, third, and festivals. In fact, when I was here, morning prayer was still part of the menu. And I said, almost across the country, we did a survey at the National House of Bishops, almost right across the whole country, it's a Eucharistic community. By the way, that gives us some challenges in a declining era. How do we provide sacramental support now for all of those places? Because we're finding it increasingly difficult, especially in more remote areas, to provide priestly assistance. So that's a challenge for us. There's been a stunning increase in social justice work. It has been a stunning increase. Anglicans get their hands dirty in this stuff of life. And the creation of the College of Bishops, for good or ill, in the Diocese of Toronto. That's a like a lot of change in 50 or 60 years. So actually the church does change, but change is difficult. But it's always a feature of a church as it adapts to its context. So York Credit Valley, I don't know if you pay any attention to anything south of 7? I'm just curious. So York Credit Valley is more or less Yonge Street, and it goes west to the west coast of Mississauga. So the dividing line is Mississauga-Oakville, and then it's Lake Ontario on the south. And so Mississauga, Brampton, Bramalea, Caledon, Peel, Bolton, that sort of area, swooping back in through the Jane Finch corridor, and actually Stephen, you're lucky to have him here, by the way, and I should have said that up front. He's a very fabulous parish priest. He was in the church closest to Jane Finch. The kind of work that he and his parish did in that community is quite legendary, actually, at St. Stephen's down through. And I think the kind of work he's done there has been amazing. Anyway, you come back down through Jane Finch and more or less back to Yonge Street. That was an area of substantive growth for the church in the 1950s and 60s. I have been to more 50th anniversary celebrations than any other kind. By the way, I don't think I mentioned that your church is the oldest building in the Diocese of Toronto, I believe, but not the oldest parish by a mile. There are still some significantly older. And I'll get to that because it's kind of important. So in Etobicoke, between St. George's on the Hill and St. Philip's, the bishop was petitioned in the 1950s to build a parish, St. Wilfrid's, which is called St. Wilfrid's. It's Kipling, but it's on Islington. It's the other way. Islington, but it's on Kipling. And because there was a community called Islington. And they petitioned the bishop. They said, Bishop, both St. Philip's and St. George's on the Hill are full, and we would like a church that we can get to if we can walk to it in less than a mile. Can we start St. Wilfrid's? And so that's how it started. St. Wilfrid's closed about 4 years ago. But it's now being repurposed, and it's being used for the Church of South India, which is in relationship to the Anglican Church, and they have quite a thriving community going on there. So stuff changes. Parish churches that are unable or unwilling to adapt in some way to their changing context actually often find themselves in decline. And sometimes, by the way, we're in decline, and it's got nothing to do with what we've done. It's just stuff. Because parish churches, like human beings, have a life cycle. There's been an Anglican presence in this part of the world since the 1600s. The parish that's reputed to have the oldest building is this one, but as I said, it's not anywhere near the oldest in the Diocese of Toronto. Now, I've been fortunate to travel a fair bit in my life, and I've paid considerable sums of money to walk over the ruins of buildings in Europe and elsewhere that were once places of faith. Parish buildings have a life cycle like human beings. So that's number 2. Number 3 are the challenges. In every era, we always just think about our own little era, but I've come, I think, in my dotage to understand something. By the way, I love this. There was a time when I was a young parish priest that I used to invite the old relics to come back to church. You know, the old rectors and the old curates, and now I'm the old relic. In every generation we face challenges, and the demographics are a real challenge for us. I want to tell you the story of St. Philip's Caribou Road. They used to be on Spadina near Dundas. How I wish we still owned that property. But in the 1950s, they determined that they would, as the church always does, move to where the people are. And their folks moved out of the heart of the city, out of that Spadina Road area, and they moved up to the Bathurst and Lawrence area, because that's where their folks moved. Now, they had strong ministry, they had good creative liturgy, and they were they had a heart for the arts. They had absolutely stunning reredos and windows in St. Philip's on Caribou Road. So, if you do look south of the Highway 7, do you have any idea of what the demographics are today at Lawrence and Bathurst?
Jewish.
The highest concentration of Jewish people in the GTA. That has generally not been a good demographic for the Anglican Church. Now look, that's not a shot, by the way. Our Christianity comes out of the Jewish tradition. I'm very, very deeply respectful for that connection. So that's not in any way a shot. It's just saying demographics matter, and it didn't work for us at Bathurst and Lawrence. So they determined a couple of years ago that they could no longer do effective ministry, and so they determined that they would close. Money was not an issue. Catch this. They had $200,000 in the bank. This was not an issue of money. This was an issue of their believing that they could no longer provide effective ministry in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, bless your heart, at the corner of Bathurst and Lawrence, so they closed. And they closed with dignity, and that was very good. St. Wilfrid's and Kipling, what they said years ago, if we can no longer offer good quality liturgy, they had a brilliant music program and a very finely crafted liturgy. If we can't do good liturgy and we can no longer do effective outreach, we need to close. And so they did. They made that determination, and they closed with dignity. Really hard. I have to say the hardest part of my job as a bishop is going and disestablishing churches. I was all about church growth and development, and this is so counterintuitive to me, but it's a reality, and it's not that anybody's fault, it's just the way it happens. Diocese of Toronto has right now about 220 congregations. We have planted over 400 churches in our past, but we've moved around. And with little places, like who even knew there was a place in Toronto called Carleton? We had a church called St. Mark's Carleton. I didn't even know there was a place in Toronto called Carleton. I mean, I knew West Toronto, I grew up in the Junction. Excuse me. I knew about Swansea and stuff like that, but I didn't even know there was a Carleton. It's not there. Nobody even thinks about it anymore, but we had a presence there. There's actually an Anglican church plaque to recognize a church that used to exist in Toronto, and I can find it for you. You may remember from Diocesan Council when David Harrison, has done a whole thing around looking at different where churches used to be. There's a McDonald's, the only one in captivity, I bet, that has a sign that said this used to be an Anglican church. So we're facing aging congregations, decreasing resources, and expensive buildings. And I suspect that we're going to see a lot of churches close over the next decade, and I think we're going to see some open. It's not all a straight downhill decline by any means. I suspect we're going to see a trend to regional churches, that is a larger multi-staff group out of one location with a series of maybe satellites. I don't know how better to say this, but a full service operation with some boutique operations in the areas. I do believe that we have an obligation to provide pastoral and sacramental support to those who brought us to the dance, actually. I suspect that we're going to see a decline in seminary-trained clergy and an increase in non-stipendiary clergy and bivocational clergy going forward. If you are in, let's say, Pangnirtung or Inuvik or somewhere in the Canadian North, it's pretty difficult to expect folks to come down to Toronto or or somewhere, Vancouver, one of the locations for our seminaries, and spend 3 years of residential training there and go back. First off, it's terribly expensive. And second, it's very impractical. So we have to find some other ways of providing good quality training for people in a more local and indigenous way. I think we're going to see more bivocational clergy, where folks have a day job from Monday to Friday and then lead the parishes on the weekend. In fact, we've already seen that. Those are the sorts of things that rural Ontario can really teach us a lot about. I was at a course on International Symposium on Ministry Development a couple of weeks ago, and I had a Homer Simpson moment. You know Homer Simpson? He goes, duh, right? My duh moment was, normal church in Canada is small church. That's normal. The average Protestant church in North America, and I don't want to let Father really, I don't want to call us Protestants totally, it's a Catholic part of me, but 50 people on Sunday morning. That's the norm. Abnormal is you guys. You're bigger. Abnormal is St. Paul's Bloor Street. Abnormal is Trinity Streetsville. So we need to rejig our thinking a little bit. Smaller is normal. Doesn't mean we're not supposed to grow. That's the call of the gospel. But it does mean that we need to give ourselves a little bit of a rethink there. I suspect that there's a number of bigger issues here. Excuse me. Number of bigger issues. Secular humanism. Do you know what the fastest growing religion by census in Toronto is? That's what everybody would say, but it's not correct. The fastest growing religion by census is no religion. Ticking off the box, no religion. If I ever lose my faith, Father, I'm going to become the high priest of no religion. There's a high degree of our society of anti-institutionalism. We can't stand the federal government. Well, I don't know what your politics are, it doesn't matter. But Mr. Harper or Ms. Wynne could not do anything right no matter what they do. I mean, one's conservative and one's liberal, that's why I picked. So it's not, there's an anti-institutionalism. We don't trust the police, we're not really sure about education. Think about it, like what hospitals, we don't trust the medical system. Like, it's an anti-institutionalism in our country, and guess what we are? An institution. Have you ever heard anyone say, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual? Anybody heard that? Yeah, okay. There's a high degree of anti-institutionalism. There's an absolutely frenetic lifestyle that we live here in Southern Ontario. Absolutely frenetic. When I was a kid, people defined regular attendance. They self-defined regular attendance to church as once a week. And people came once a week. If you came to church, you came every week. Now they self-define it as 3 times, one every 3 Sundays. So you know, remember the old thing, I didn't know that event was happening because they're only there one every 3 weeks to hear about it, which means redundant communication is really very important in church land. We're not on the radar screen of urban planners. I don't know if you know the Ontario lands, the old railway lands down in Toronto, but Toronto is predicting 1 million more people to live in that area as over the next period of time. It's already started. And so the urban planners did not have 1 square inch of that property set aside for religious houses of worship of any flavor. And why is that? They don't know what we do. It's benign. I think it may get malignant in our society a little later on, but right now I think it's benign. They don't know what we do, they don't see our value to society. So just as a sidebar, I've encouraged the Diocese of Toronto to engage in what's called the HALO project. There were a group of people, now I have to say up front, I don't like this is the means to the end. I do not like the means, I don't like the justification for this, but I do understand why we need to do it. They did a survey in Philadelphia, excuse me, because the folks were off the radar screen. Church and religious houses of worship were off the radar screen. So they did a survey in Philadelphia to figure out what the economic impact of the church was on the city of Philadelphia in a year. Why? Because town councilors are about the economics. Someone in 1960 said we all have to genuflect at the altar of the economy, and we've all been doing that ever since. It's the most important thing in everybody's lives now. It's ridiculous, by the way. God's supposed to be the most important thing in our life, but we make the economy. So they went and they figured out the church contributes $57 million annually to the city of Philadelphia. That has made a difference in the minds of counselors as they begin to figure out what the impact of the church is. For instance, when we counsel Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones in the office, the healthcare system doesn't have to deal with them. When we provide places for AA and NA and GA and all those A's, they don't have to go somewhere else. It's part of the safety net. And with good or ill, our government downloaded a lot of social services. Really, the church has picked that up. And when I get around, I remember, I will refer to this document at the end because it speaks just to that. So anyway, we're engaged with some folks at Ryerson University as part of a wider study to figure out, so we can say to the City of Toronto and elsewhere, what is the impact, the economic impact? I don't think the church is about what the economic impact is, but I get why we have to do that in a secular society. So that's why I don't like the means, but I do like the end if we can get better on the radar screen. Land is not being designated for houses of worship. There's a distrust of organized religion, and with good reason. Whole child abuse thing, doesn't matter that it's very few clergy. We're all tarred with that brush. The Indian residential school system, not our finest hour as a country or as a church, but it is what it is. And that's what gets on the front page of the paper or on the website, and everybody, the Anglicans are front and center on that. We have the challenge to adopt culturally to changes from people who are coming from other parts of the world who are our brother and sister Anglicans, and to figure out how best to deal with that. Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world. This is a terrible story, but it's a true story. Karen and I rent a condo right at the foot of Bay Street. It's really kind of cool, and so we're wandering around down on the harbour front. And there's a buskers there in the summertime. It's very vibrant, actually. It's really quite wonderful. And there's a busker there doing some kind of, throwing things that were on fire in the air and swallowing them and all that sort of stuff. So he attracted a lot of folks. And he said to somebody, "Where are you from?" The guy said, "I'm from Miami." He said, "Well, Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world. In fact," he said, "I think it's the safest city in the whole world." That's not politically correct, but I thought it was true. He said, "I'll tell you why." He said, "We're not going to get bombed by anybody, because if anybody comes over and bombs us, they're going to kill a relative." Now that was the busker, and I apologize for the political incorrectness of it, but it does get to the point. And the point is, we're the most multicultural church multicultural city in the world. My area, York Credit Valley, includes 2 Hispanic congregations, including San Lorenzo. You may know that one. That's Caravan of Hope and all that stuff. One Chinese church that offers services every Sunday morning in Mandarin, Cantonese, and English. We have services offered in Sudanese, Punjabi, Italian, Portuguese, Urdu, 2 Ghanaian churches, Church of South India, none of whom use English as their first language for services. Excuse me. We no longer enjoy the support of institutions. When I was here, the Lord's Prayer still opened the school day in the education system. Doesn't do that anymore. When I was a kid, there would not be a public building open anywhere around here that didn't have the local minister or the local Anglican bishop there. Excuse me. Even in the days of Leslie Frost and so on as premier, you look at a picture at any formal meal, and there's the Bishop of Toronto sitting on his left or right hand. We don't enjoy that support. We started the public school system. We started the hospital system. We don't enjoy that support. Nowadays, it's hard enough to get clergy into hospitals in order to provide spiritual need, because the government is no longer recognizing that as important. When I go to other parts of the world, you should see parishes that have training centers and schools and universities and all attached and parochial. High schools, public schools, incredible. We don't enjoy that anymore. Sunday is an ordinary day now. There's no difference. I mean, one of the many things I lost in my battles over the years was trying to maintain Sunday as a day of rest. I still think it's a good idea. I don't see the advantage of wide open Sunday shopping, but that's just the way it is. Efforts are being made to remove anything religious from governments. There's a debate going on now with the CRA and the Charities Directorate as to whether churches should still enjoy tax-free status. That's going to change because churches are renting their buildings out all the time, and people are saying, well, you're in direct competition with commercial stuff. You should be taxed, etc., etc. That's on the radar screen. People are not joining things. generally. They don't volunteer for things generally as they used to. People are traveling a whole bunch more. They're moving around. And so all of those things, I think, are part of the challenges that we face. But every era has faced challenges. It's not like we're the first people in the history of Christianity to have a challenge. So we just have to figure it out. And so, a lot of good, faithful people are trying to figure out how we proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's nothing new at all here in terms of the church having to adapt to this stuff. And then consistency. We're getting near the end. Are you glad your eyes aren't still sort of with me? Only 5 people are sleeping. I'm really grateful. I'm actually very optimistic about the future of the church. It's my sense that, see, the church has been around for 2,000 years. And what I finally figured out is my little bit of it's about this much. And remember that song, I got along without you before, I'm not going to get along without you now. It's still going. Like there were, for 1960 years, the church survived without me, and I think it's going to in the future. It may not survive with a particular church building or in a particular expression, those may move and so on, but this is God's church. We're not a church with a God, it's God that has a church. It's God's church to God's people doing God's mission in God's world. And you and I have the enormous privilege of being a partner in that. And I think that's very exciting. We're disciples of Jesus Christ. Prayer and sacrament and serving others and worship are central to who we are. And we can do that, my friends, whether it's in the backyard of what used to be Thorough McDonald's place, or whether it's here in the building or wherever it is, we can do that. We have prayer, sacrament, serving others, and worship. I've been to parts of the world where there are no church buildings, where they gather under a gum tree or whatever it is, and they have worship. We can worship God anywhere. That's the central reason, in my view, people were created in the first place, is for the worship of Almighty God. We're missional. We've got to figure this out. How do we get engaged outside in the world? I'll give you a little quick example of one that's never been written up, as far as I know. There was a parish that was trying to figure out what they could do missionally, and a woman said, I had a problem. My clothes washer broke, and it took weeks to get someone in to fix it, so I had to go to the local laundromat. And I did the local laundromat, and while I was there, I went into Tim Hortons, decided to get a coffee, and I noticed every Monday morning when I went to do the laundry, the same group of women were sitting in that chair having a coffee together. And I wondered, what could we do to begin to get a relationship going? And she said, what would it be if the altar guild every Monday morning determined that the way they would clean the linens of the church would be to go to the laundromat and then start a conversation with these women who were... Now, I don't know what came of that, but that's the kind of thinking. And it's not a matter of saying, hey, Stephen, what's your relationship to Jesus Christ? That's not the opening question, because that'll put little hairs up in the back of people's head. But it is a matter of getting into relationships. So how do we get to know people? And there's lots of very creative things going on right now. Archbishop Rowan Williams refers to this as mixed economy or a mixed ecology church. The received church and the missional church. The received church is what I grew up in. I suspect most of you grew up in, and it's what you like, and I like. That's who I am. Okay. The missional church is stuff where we got to get creative. So, for instance, if there was a group of people that wanted to do skateboarding for Jesus, I don't like to skateboard. I'm not interested in skateboarding. My boys love skateboarding, wakeboarding, snowboarding, anything on the board. I'm not at all interested. That is not good for me. But if the Spirit is moving, I need to stay out of the way and let skateboarding for Jesus happen, if that's a way to be able to attract some folks. You see what I'm trying to say? Okay. So, the mission field is no longer in some other part of the world as it was when I was a kid. I remember the deputations, and some of you might remember deputations that would come particularly from China and from Africa in those days to tell us about mission that they were involved in. And we'd meet in a parish hall and we'd have some conversation about it, get all excited about mission in other parts of the world. Well, the mission field is no longer Asia and Africa. It's outside the front door of our church. It's right here in Thornhill. It's right on Brook Street. It's right on Center Street. It's right in the neighborhood. And I am sure that Benjamin Thorne and William Park Parsons would not have imagined Holy Trinity Thornhill, what it would look like 185 years after they had the first service. I imagine they would not have imagined what their church would look like today. I think they could have figured out we still pray. They could have figured out we still worship. They could have figured out we still have Holy Communion. But this church would not look anything like Mr. Parsons and Mr. Thorne thought would. And I even doubt if they thought we'd still be around. I imagine they didn't think we'd still be around. But here you are. And so I wanted to say once again, we are not a church with a God. It's God that has a church. This is God's church. This is God's mission to God's people, through God's church, into God's world. Each generation has raised up men and women for leadership in God's church. I don't think the church is going anywhere soon. I don't think God's plan is for the church to go the way of the dodo. It's not what I see. I don't think the church is going anywhere soon. I think local parishes will open, local parishes will close, they'll grow or they'll shrink, but Christianity is not going anywhere anytime soon. We have been given a great gift and a God-given gift of life. It's an enormous gift that God has given to us, the very breath of life. We have accepted on some level or other in our lives to accept the call of Jesus to be a follower. Today is all that we have. Today really is all that we have. And God invites us to live it in relationship with God. And if after we sleep tonight, God should entrust us to live another day of God's gift of life, let's try to live it as fully and as faithfully as we can. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. So I think we need to hold firm. I think we need to relax. I think the universe is unfolding the way that it should. And thank God, I think God is still in charge of God's universe.